A deadly weapon guards the truth behind one of the most infamous kidnappings of modern times.
These people were ready for a war. There's just no other way to describe it.
A mysterious sea creature that holds an amazing secret.
It's the most opportunistic predator in the world.
And the riddle of what caused one of the worst natural disasters in American history.
Buildings collapsed. Streets were torn open. The city was devastated.
Across the United States, in the nation's most revered institutions, our celebrated history is on display. Wondrous treasures from the past, bizarre relics. But behind every amazing artifact is another tale to be told, and a secret waiting to be revealed. These are the mysteries at the museum. Los Angeles, California, the entertainment capital of the world. A city of glamour, sunshine, and dreams that is the ultimate destination for those in search of stardom. But LA also has a dark side. And at the Los Angeles Police Museum, former LA cop Glenn Martin stands guard over a collection that chronicles the city's most infamous criminal cases. From the Manson family murders to the Hillside Strangler.
There are, in fact, some of the most notorious and important cases in the entire history of the United States that occurred here in Los Angeles.
But one object in this collection tells a bizarre story unlike any other. It played a crucial role in the evolution of an extraordinary criminal. This World War II-era semi-automatic rifle is 3 feet long, weighs 5.2 pounds, and can unleash a devastating 1,200 rounds per minute.
It's an M1 carbine seized in the aftermath of one of the most notorious shootouts in United States history.
Experts believe that this machine gun belonged to a legendary fugitive, a violent felon who called herself Tanya, and whose reign of terror gripped the nation. But this was no ordinary villain. To her friends and family, she was an innocent 20-year-old student. Her real name? Patty Hearst.
Patty Hearst was a newspaper heiress. Her father was Randolph Hearst, whose father was William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper magnate. So she was a well-to-do young lady who was a college student at Berkeley.
But in April 1974, these images of a gun-toting Patty Hearst holding up a San Francisco bank shocked the nation. What made Patty Hearst turn from a family girl into a gun-toting villain is one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of modern crime. The story begins 2 months earlier, on the night of February 4th, 1974. Patty Hearst is at home in her Berkeley apartment, watching television with her fiancé, when the doorbell rings. Three armed criminals burst in. They beat up Patty's fiancé and drag Patty into the street.
Patty's stuffed in the trunk of her car, and the abductors drive off and vanish into the night.
Patty Hearst has been kidnapped. But who the kidnappers are and what they want is a mystery. Then, 8 days later, a Berkeley radio station receives an anonymous audio tape. On the tape is a message from Patty Hearst.
I'm with a combat unit that's armed with automatic weapons. They're perfectly willing to die for what they're doing.
Through this tape, we learned that the people that kidnapped Patty Hearst were in fact the Symbionese Liberation Army.
The Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA, is a gang of left-wing extremists whose aim is to destroy capitalist society by any means possible.
The SLA wasn't your run-of-the-mill leftist group from the late 60s, early 70s. They were highly militant.
The group demands that Patty's family devote some of their vast wealth to feeding the poor. And Patty's father complies.
Millions of dollars of food were set aside to feed the poor as directed.
But Patty is still not released. Then a shocking event transforms the case and leaves the nation reeling. On April 15th, in San Francisco's quiet Sunset District, robbers burst into a bank, make off with $10,000 in cash, and shoot 2 innocent bystanders in the process. At first, it seems to be another violent but run-of-the-mill bank job. But when the FBI examines the surveillance footage, they make a startling discovery. The robbers are known members of the SLA. And the dark-haired woman brandishing an M1 carbine is none other than Patty Hearst.
Hearst is caught on camera helping hold up a bank with her captors.
The searing images of Hearst toting a rifle are broadcast on the nightly news. America is stunned. Was Patty Hearst forced by her captors to take part in the heist? Or has the young heiress willingly converted to the revolutionary cause? The answer comes in the form of another audio tape.
For those people who still believe that I'm brainwashed or dead, I am a soldier in the People's Army.
That was a declaration that she was, in fact, a domestic terrorist. Patty was a member of the SLA.
Law enforcement agencies across the state launch a massive operation to catch the terrorist cell. And 1 month later, they get their break. On May 16, 1974, police tracked the terrorist to a safe house in the Los Angeles suburb of Inglewood. The gun battle that ensues is one of the most notorious in police history.
These people were ready for a war. And there's just no other way to describe it.
The shootout rages for 2 hours before the gang's hideout goes up in flames. In the ashes, police find the bodies of 6 SLA militants and the M1 carbine they believe Patty Hearst used in the bank robbery a month before. The young heiress is nowhere to be found, but the gun and the picture of her wielding it will seal her fate in court. Finally, after months of hunting, police get a tip and arrest Patty Hearst back in San Francisco. 2 years to the day after she was first kidnapped, Patty Hearst is put on trial for armed robbery, and the evidence is stacked against her. Photos of Patty holding the M1 carbine are central to the prosecution's case.
And suddenly public opinion about Hearst has shifted from one of sympathy to one of ridicule and anger. They feel betrayed by her.
But Patty Hearst's defense team argues that she was brainwashed by her captors.
They claim anyone who may have been quarantined and raped or assaulted obviously will do whatever her captors say in order to get out of that situation.
But the jury doesn't buy it.
And a guilty verdict was returned, and Patty Hearst was sent off to federal prison.
She is sentenced to 35 years behind bars. But some are sympathetic to Patty's plight, including President Jimmy Carter. And after serving just 22 months, her sentence is commuted, and Patty Hearst is released and eventually receives a presidential pardon. Today, for many people, the actions Patty Hearst took during her kidnapping nearly 40 years ago remain an utter mystery. Was she brainwashed? Was she tortured? Or did she convert willingly to the SLA? No one can say for sure. And although this weapon's reign of terror is long over, inside the LA Police Museum, it still bears witness to a young girl's bizarre transformation from college student to armed robber. Nearly a century earlier, a very different kind of crime was committed in a most unexpected place. At the Harvard Museum of Natural History in Cambridge, Massachusetts, this giant fossil lies at the center of a spine-tingling murder mystery. Coming up next on Mysteries at the Museum. Boston, Massachusetts is home to one of the nation's first museums, the Harvard Museum of Natural History. Over 21 million specimens crowd these halls and tell the dramatic story of life on Earth. But the most twisted tale within these walls belongs to this beast. It weighs some 7 tons, and its tusks are 5 feet long. The fossilized bones were unearthed in 1844, but the species died off 10,000 years ago. This is the Harvard Mastodon. This majestic creature plays a key role in a bizarre story, a tale of ambition, greed, and murder inside one of the nation's most esteemed universities. Boston, 1844. An ambitious Harvard medical professor named John Webster sees an opportunity to achieve instant fame. He longs to purchase one of the finest mastodon skeletons in the world and donate it to Harvard College. At At the dawn of the scientific revolution, a race for bones was on, and competition among intellectuals was fierce.
Collecting fossils was associated with sort of the upper class or the social elite.
For the driven Webster, the purchase of this mastodon is a chance to achieve glory and prestige.
This specimen in particular was one of those rare, nearly intact specimens, so it certainly would be a boon to have in Harvard's collection.
But an obstacle stands in Webster's way. He cannot afford the specimen's $3,000 price tag.
$3,000 at that time, while it doesn't sound like much to us, was actually about the equivalent of $200,000.
But a determined Webster will not be stopped. He solicits donations from friends and colleagues.
Webster was known for living beyond his means. Although he made a nice salary as a medical faculty, he made some imprudent decisions about finances.
Webster struggles to raise the funds and approaches fellow Harvard alumnus George Parkman for a loan on the remaining sum.
Parkman came from a very wealthy family. His main occupation was to take care of the estate of his father.
Parkman's generous loan gives Webster the amount he needs, and finally, the mastodon goes on display. But soon, Webster's debts grow out of control, and the story of scholarly triumph takes an ominous turn. In late November 1849, Webster's donor, George Parkman, mysteriously disappears. When police launch a missing persons investigation, they discover a curious piece of information. The last place Parkman was seen was entering Harvard Medical College to visit Professor John Webster. Was Parkman there to collect on his loan? And did Webster have a hand in Parkman's disappearance? The police aren't the only ones to harbor suspicions about John Webster. The medical school janitor, Ephraim Littlefield, has also observed strange goings-on in Webster's lab.
He noticed odd behavior, including Webster locking his laboratory, which he wasn't known to do. The water was apparently running constantly, and the furnace was blazing.
The janitor, Littlefield, is convinced that behind closed doors, Webster is concealing something incriminating, and embarks on an investigation of his own. One night, Littlefield creeps through the tunnels under the foundations of the medical school. The janitor approaches the wall under Webster's lab and begins to chisel through 5 layers of brick. In the space between the walls, he finds a horrifying sight. The dismembered remains of George Parkman.
At the time, this was certainly big news, and in part because of the gory details associated with dismembering a human body, but also because it involved 2 well-educated members of Boston's high society.
The city of Boston is stunned, and Professor John Webster is arrested for murder. In 1850, janitor Ephraim Littlefield's damning testimony leads to Webster's conviction, and he is sentenced to death by hanging. The quest to display this fossil has taken the lives of 2 men, but the mastodon still stands among the fossils at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, telling its own version of the complicated story of life and death. Across the country, in San Diego, California, works another strange and powerful beast. One that is very much alive.
It's the most opportunistic predator in the world.
Next on Mysteries at the Museum. San Diego, California. Home of the world-famous Scripps Institution of Oceanography. This aquarium holds 175,000 gallons of water and houses a wondrous display of aquatic life. But behind the scenes, among the many thousands of specimens in the institution's research labs, is a curious organism, preserved in its various stages of life. At birth, it's smaller than a rice grain, but it doesn't stay that way for long. With a voracious appetite, it rapidly transforms into a 6-foot monster. Scientists at Scripps are studying what is perhaps one of the most mysterious and misunderstood creatures in the sea.
We're only skimming the surface on understanding their basic biology, let alone to understand how they're changing over time.
Some know this creature as a real-life monster of the deep, a vicious beast known as the Red Demon, or the Flying Squid. But its real name is the Humboldt squid. Native to the waters of the eastern Pacific Ocean, the Humboldt squid is far more common than its infamous cousin, the giant squid, and to some, it's even more dreaded. It's rumored to pull fishermen from boats and drag them beneath the sea. What makes the Humboldt squid one of the sea's most prolific and powerful predators? And is its ferocious reputation deserved? In the quest to unmask its secrets, scientists at Scripps are studying the squid's anatomy in the safety of the lab. But they aren't the only ones seeking to unlock the squid's secrets. Professional diver Scott Cassell hunts down the beast in its lair, and his face-to-face encounters confirm the squid's monstrous strength.
As a diver, I've been attacked hundreds of times by Humboldt squid, and I'll tell you, they are magnificently powerful. I've had my right arm yanked out of its socket. I've had my wrist broken 5 times. I've had my eardrum ruptured by being slapped upside the head. They are dangerous animals.
Animals that are armed with a fearsome arsenal of weapons. Its tentacles are lined not only with suckers, but razor-sharp teeth.
Once they are able to latch onto a prey item, they're able to dig into the tissue and hold onto it very securely.
But perhaps the most deadly and distinctive feature of this animal is its beak.
All the squids are soft-bodied, and yet the beak is a very hardened substance.
The powerful beak is razor-sharp, so it can latch onto prey.
This enables the animal to use this wicked blade-like structure to tear away the soft tissues of their prey.
With this array of weapons, the squid is an unrivaled hunter.
Humboldt squid are basically eating machines. They're amazingly voracious predators.
And when food is scarce, they will even resort to cannibalism.
It's thought that as much as 20% of the diet can be its own species.
But is the Humboldt squid an indiscriminate killer? Or is this monster somehow misunderstood? Scripps scientists studying the Humboldt squid have been part of an extraordinary discovery that may shed light on this creature's behavior. The Humboldt squid is one of the fastest growing animals in the world.
Humboldt squid take between 1 to 2 years to mature.
In this short period of time, it grows from a fraction of an inch to up to 6 feet in length. The bigger the animal grows, the less likely it is to be eaten by another predator. And it is this rapid transformation that explains its voracious feeding habits. The reason why the Humboldt squid is such an aggressive hunter is because it needs vast amounts of food just to sustain its incredible growth spurt. As the squid grows bigger, so does its appetite and its prey. But should people be worried about this aggressive predator?
The Humboldt squid represent a threat only to the people who are unfortunate enough to have come in close contact with them at a time when they're feeding or otherwise disturbed.
With its stunning rate of growth, the Humboldt squid is brilliantly adapted for the challenges of life in the deep. Here at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, researchers continue to study this awesome creature in their quest to unlock the mysteries of the sea. To the east, in the New Mexico desert, the tentacles of the Soviet KGB reach inside a U.S. weapons facility, plunder the nation's most guarded secret, and change the course of history. How did it happen? Find out when Mysteries at the Museum returns. Northern New Mexico. Nearly 70 years ago in this desert, scientists at Los Alamos National Labs changed the course of history by detonating the first nuclear bomb. Today, the Bradbury Science Museum honors the work of these groundbreaking government scientists. But some of the most explosive items in this collection cannot be found on the museum floor. They're held in a special collections archive. Carefully preserved in between sheets of plastic are 18 cards, 2 inches wide by 2 inches long. These are security passes that granted exclusive access to the top-secret Los Alamos labs. But one of these passes stands apart from the others. It tells a story of intrigue and betrayal that sent shockwaves all the way to the Kremlin and the White House. Its owner was a man named Klaus Fuchs. What he did change the world forever. July 1945. World War II is over in Europe, but fighting against the Japanese rages in the Pacific. In New Mexico, government scientists are working on a secret weapon that they hope will win the war for the U.S. Codename, the Manhattan Project.
The Manhattan Project was a national effort to build the world's first nuclear weapons. Everything about the project was top secret. Security was enforced at every location in the project. Any breach of that would have horrified the administrators.
But as scientists in New Mexico prepare the first nuclear weapon to be dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, U.S. intelligence agents fear that America's enemies are trying to steal the bomb's secrets. Since the early days of World War II, U.S. officials, deeply distrustful of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, have been poring over Russian communications, searching for evidence of Soviet spies within the United States.
At the end of World War II, they're our allies, but we knew that the Soviet Union was going to be an adversary of some sort moving forward into the future.
But it isn't until 1948 that U.S. codebreakers decipher a series of secret Soviet communiques known as the Venona Papers.
The Venona Papers not only confirmed people's worst suspicions, but it confirmed that things were worse than they ever possibly imagined.
The transmissions reveal that the Manhattan Project has been infiltrated. The communiques are littered with the names of secret operatives working within the United States.
Of the different code names, there's one prominent name in particular, and that name is REST.
Some in U.S. intelligence believe that the operative known as REST may have passed the secrets of the nuclear bomb to the Russians. But the identity of REST and where he is hiding is a mystery. In the summer of 1949, American investigators working with their British counterparts close in on a suspect. A former Los Alamos scientist and communist sympathizer named Klaus Fuchs. As a theoretical physicist working on the Manhattan Project, Fuchs had access to highly sensitive information relating to the inner workings of the atomic bomb itself. In 1950, Fuchs is arrested. Under interrogation, he confesses that he is the spy codenamed REST and reveals the details of his stunning betrayal.
We know that Klaus Fuchs met with his contact in Santa Fe. They would set a location to meet. Fuchs would get in his car with the contact, and that's where they would have their conversation.
Fuchs meets his KGB contact at least 8 times from 1943 to 1945, leaking information that had the power to destroy human civilization in the blink of an eye.
Klaus Fuchs gave detailed drawings with exact dimensions for parts of the bomb. He gave them all sorts of technical, theoretical information about the bombs, the type of explosives used. Because of Klaus Fuchs, the Soviet Union had a playbook for developing their own nuclear weapons program.
Fuchs is tried and convicted of espionage and sentenced to 14 years in prison. But the treachery of this atomic spy would shape the world for generations to come.
Really ratcheted up the Cold War. It led to the rush development of the hydrogen bomb, to the McCarthy era in this country, and really changed the way that people thought in this country.
And at the heart of Klaus Fuchs' betrayal is this security pass. Without it, he could never have betrayed this country and passed nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. It stands as a reminder of how the actions of just one person can fundamentally change the world forever. A half-century before the genesis of man-made weapons of mass destruction, San Francisco was annihilated by a devastating natural disaster, and this horse-drawn fire engine was a witness to the apocalypse. What happened? Find out next on Mysteries at the Museum. San Francisco, California, the Paris of the West. This spectacular modern city was founded on the riches unearthed during the famous 19th century gold rush. At the San Francisco Fire Museum, veteran firefighter Paul Barry and his crew maintain the equipment that's been used to fight fires in the city for 150 years.
Engine 10, engine 10, engine 10. It took a lot of guys to pump this thing. There's usually 6 on each side. And after about a couple of minutes, you're pretty well exhausted. This thing itself will go about 100 feet or so.
Of all the vintage fire engines in the collection, one stands out above the others. It weighs over 5,000 pounds. It's made of wood and steel, with the ability to pump 550 gallons of water per minute. This workhorse put out countless fires in its day. But this state-of-the-art LaFrance fire engine would be no match against a disaster that brought San Francisco to its knees. A cataclysmic series of events that razed 50% of the city's buildings to the ground and claimed over 3,000 lives. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history. But what really destroyed San Francisco on that fateful day? The answer may surprise you. April 18th, 1906. As the sun rises, no one has any idea what horrors are about to be visited upon the city.
It was a calm morning, just like any other, until about 5:12 when disaster struck. And San Francisco was hit with the biggest earthquake the world had known up until that time. The earthquake was magnitude 8.1. It lasted about 42 seconds. The city was devastated. Buildings collapsed. Streets were torn open.
But the earthquake was not the only disaster to befall San Francisco on that day. The greatest calamity lay ahead.
The earthquake ruptured gas lines all throughout the city, which was a recipe for disaster.
Gas leaks out of the broken lines and quickly ignites. Before long, many of the buildings that had withstood the earthquake are ablaze. The courageous firemen of the San Francisco Fire Department's Company 26 rush to the scene. With the help of this LaFrance engine, they battle the growing inferno.
They were doing the best they could with what they had, but nobody up until that point had ever experienced anything like that.
But an even worse shock is in store for the heroic firemen. The gas mains were not the only pipes to be damaged by the earthquake.
As the firemen went to connect their hoses to the outlet of the hydrant, nothing came out because the water lines had all broken.
Firemen can only watch in horror as fires spring up across the city, spreading from street to street. Company 26's LaFrance engine, the department's best weapon, sits idle and powerless as the fires merge into one giant inferno.
Once they ran out of water, the fight was over.
The situation seems utterly hopeless. By day's end, the earthquake is a distant memory, dwarfed by the firestorm engulfing the city. It takes days for Company 26 and the rest of the city's embattled fire department to finally prevail. They use Van Ness Avenue, a 100-foot wide thoroughfare, as a natural fire break and extinguish the blaze. The Great Fire has leveled the city and claimed over 3,000 lives.
Though most people might be familiar with San Francisco in 1906 because of the Great Earthquake, it was the fire that caused 90% of the damage to the city.
In the aftermath, hope and renewal emerge from the ashes. San Francisco quickly rebuilds and soon regains its status as the dominant city of the West. In 1917, nearly 10 years after the disaster, Company 26 buys its first motorized fire engine, and their LaFrance steam engine, which fought in vain against the biggest fire the city has ever known, is retired. Today, this engine is one of the few surviving relics that recall one of the worst natural disasters in American history. It is a testament to the brave men who responded to an earthquake and an even more devastating fire that they and their equipment could not contain. While a disaster tested the will of a city's fire department across the country on Ellis Island, a simple test would determine the fate of thousands. How did desperate immigrants outwin an exam designed to keep them out of America? The answer is coming up on Mysteries at the Museum. About a mile from Manhattan, across the Hudson River, stands one of the nation's most iconic landmarks. It is the epicenter of the greatest migration in modern history. Ellis Island. Today, millions of Americans have ancestors that landed here. The Ellis Island Immigration Museum tells the story of this legendary site and the 12 million people who pass through these halls. Barry Moreno is the museum's curator.
The main building is the iconic building. This is where all the immigrants had to come through. And you get that sense in the building, how it was intended for large crowds.
Despite the sheer numbers of people that arrived at Ellis Island, not everyone was allowed into America. In the early 20th century, as more and more immigrants came to the U.S., authorities implemented a simple but daunting exam designed to keep illiterate immigrants out. In the museum's collection is a relic of that dreaded test. This simple 3x5-inch card is inscribed with a short piece of text. It's called a literacy card. Its function? To determine whether a new arrival could read. In theory, the test should have prevented thousands of poor, illiterate immigrants, mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe, from gaining entry into the U.S. But it didn't. Because what the immigrants lacked in literacy, they made up for in cunning and guile. So how did they get past the Ellis Island literacy test and make it into the USA? January 1892, New York Harbor. The very first shiploads of immigrants makes landfall at Ellis Island. After their long and grueling ocean voyages, the aspiring Americans line up and await inspection.
And as they entered, the first person they met to examine them was a physician dressed in a military uniform. The doctor quickly examined each person approaching him. He would look at your face, your skin, your eyes for sign of any disease or illness.
While a few are turned back, the vast majority of arrivals make the cut. Before 1900, Ellis Island is processing some 5,000 people every day. They are mostly English, Irish, German, and Scandinavian. These new arrivals are vital to the success of the young nation.
There were lots of companies that were popping up that needed workers. So they were desperately urging people like the Irish, the Germans, to come to work in mills and factories and mines across the country.
News of golden opportunities in America spreads back across the Atlantic, and a steady stream of immigrants becomes a flood. This new wave is made up of people from Southern and Eastern Europe seeking to escape the crushing poverty of their homelands. These people look and sound different from the previous generation of immigrants.
Many were alarmed by the huge numbers of Slavic, Jewish, and Latin peoples from different parts of Europe.
Some Americans feel that the population is growing too large, while others worry that this new wave of immigrants will pose a threat to their jobs. Opportunistic politicians pander to these concerns and come up with a new way to limit immigration. In 1917, Congress passes the Literacy Act.
The Literacy Act was part of a whole group of laws that they were devising to block immigration from Europe. It was to keep out certain types of people.
Now, those in search of a new life must prove that they can read before they are allowed into the United States. And this card will determine the fate of many. It contains text written in their native language, often religious passages from the Bible. The instructions are simple.
You would just, read it to the inspector to see if you can read.
For many of the poor, uneducated immigrants, this is a daunting challenge. Failure means a heartbreaking return back to the land they are fleeing.
The fear that it must have clutched the heart of an immigrant standing there when the inspector handed him or her one, they have a huge cultural, historical weight.
But many desperate and determined immigrants soon figure out ways to beat the test.
Well, Ellis Island immigrants are known to have been very cunning.
Often younger, more educated family members who had already taken the test would tip off the older generations as to which religious verses were printed on the cards.
Actually, a lot of these people knew these prayers, but they just didn't know which ones were written down.
For many parents and grandparents, years of religious devotion now pays off.
These people came from a world of oral tradition. So many of them had no trouble catching on and knew the prayer already once they were tipped off.
For those who pass the literacy test, the land of opportunity awaits. And soon these newcomers have the chance to offer their skills and energy to the growing nation. In the decades ahead, politicians will implement straightforward quotas to limit the flow of new arrivals. Traffic to Ellis Island slows, and by 1954, immigrant processing moves into Manhattan. And Ellis Island, the gateway to America, closes for good. Today, the Ellis Island Immigration Museum stands as a beacon of hope. And this small 3x5 card is a reminder of the determination and cunning of the many immigrants who came to pursue a better life in America. Fossils and fire engines. A tale of survival and triumphant arrivals. A stunning betrayal. And magnificent creatures of the sea. Wondrous objects, each with a gripping story to tell. These are the mysteries at the museum.